I invite Dr. Diane Turab Nkosi, Chair of the UWI Guardian Group Premium Open Lecture, to the stage.
All protocol duly observed by the previous speakers. I would like to wish you all a very warm welcome and a pleasant good evening. Before I introduce the featured speaker, I just want to acknowledge 3 persons in the audience who, without these persons, we would not have maintained this event. So I'd like for us to acknowledge Dr. Betty Ann Roller, who, as former coordinator of the Instructional Development Unit, initiated the relationship between the UE and the Guardian Group. Dr. Roller. I would also like to acknowledge our former director, Dr. Anna Mae Edwards-Henry, who maintained this as a very significant part of the St. Augustine campus's calendar, Dr. Edwards-Henry. And Professor Margaret Rouse-Jones, who is with us, was our chairperson and a very hardworking member of the committee for all these years. So I'd like to acknowledge her as well. Thank you. And so I'm going to introduce to you all another strong woman, and that's Professor Elizabeth Barkley, who I'm sure you all have read the program and you can see all her accomplishments. She has published several books on student engagement. She has designed an online course that has won awards. And this is a course in music history, and it's a foundation course. And as those of you on this campus who know about foundation courses and the size of these courses would understand how difficult it is to engage students in a foundation course. And she won an award for an online foundation course in music history. She has interrogated the meaning of student engagement in order to develop a more comprehensive and nuanced understanding of what engagement is. To more effectively promote it in her students. She has spent more than 4 decades, and when you look at her, you wouldn't guess that, but she has spent more than 4 decades in higher education. She has worked as a dean, and she has struggled with some of the same issues that we here on this campus struggle with. And she has written about these issues, and she's going to be here today to share them with us. And she's still in the trenches working as a lecturer, as a professor. And so here to share her decades of experience with us, I am very pleased and honored to invite to the stage Professor Elizabeth Barkley.
Let's see, you can hear me, the amazing miracle of amplification. I am so delighted to be here with you tonight. This is my first trip to Trinidad, and I've been so impressed with the graciousness of the people, the beauty of your country, and even your wonderful anthem. I thought, that's so beautiful. I love your national anthem. I won't repeat the long list of people who I, of course, should also thank, because clearly I will forget someone, and many of you have already enumerated the various people who have been involved. But I would like to say to all of you and all of the people on the organizing committee, as well as the representatives from Guardian and from the university, thank you for this privilege to be here with you tonight. Now, Diane made one small mathematical error. She said that I was over 40 years in education. I am just slightly under 40 years in education, 39, so I don't want to be prematurely aged, although I do appreciate so much your very lovely introduction. But I wanted to provide you with a little bit of context. So I have been in higher education for 39 years, working at the college. And during that time, I was 10 years as a dean. And I loved being a dean, but then for personal reasons, I asked to return to the faculty. And I wanted to share with you a picture of my classroom the first day that I came back to teach. Some of you may recognize a little bit of the sense, but despite that look, I plowed through with energy on my planned curriculum to engage them in a stimulating discussion on the structural nuances of a Beethoven symphony. Now, excuse me, but their musical heroes at the time were Tupac and Nine Inch Nails. They could care less about Beethoven. And I'm sure that if they had had a remote, they would have changed the channel. But it got worse. Within about 2 weeks into my new glorious return to teaching, I was called into the office of the new dean, the dean that I had helped hire, as I listened to him read through a long list of complaints from some particularly unhappy students. I was too young to retire, so I decided I had to look at what I was doing at a very basic level. Years later, I met a man who is a very prominent speaker on student education and on engagement in the United States. Now, this isn't really him, but I have to protect his anonymity. So I picked a picture that kind of looked like his personality. And yes, so anyway, I, of course, appreciated the fact that he had all sorts of comments about how I should engage my students. But the problem that I had was that he hadn't actually been back in a classroom for 35 years. And so I told him, you know, you'd have a little more authority if you spent a little bit of time in one of today's classrooms. He took my advice. One of the only people I ever know who ever did that. But he did take my advice, and he got a part-time adjunct position at a local university. He spent 6 months preparing for his return teaching. And I know in his heart of hearts, he was so persuaded that he was going to be such a dynamic success. I don't know if you have this, but in our country, we do. We have something called Rate My Professor, which is an anonymous way for students to comment about their professors. I think he was sure that it was going to be so good that his students would race to rate my professors, and they'd have to come up with a new category to capture his hotness, like a smoking chili pepper. So I was very intrigued when, a few weeks after his return to teaching, he sent me an email. And the title of the email was, "Read it, weep." And so I wanted to share with you just a little bit of his email. Teaching? Why does anyone try? My semester has been hugely disappointing. I went into it believing that students would feel my enthusiasm, respect my intelligence, and want to share both. Individual students, don't get me started, as it is likely to reveal in me strong emotional forces tempting me into using my gifts for language in the service of a pettiness destined to erode the moral character I've spent a lifetime to build up. I feel like a total failure and doubt I will ever teach again. Now, I'm looking at you. You're nice people. You're kind of smiling. Some of you are thinking, "Aw, poor guy." You know what I thought? Yes. After I had revitalized or changed my teaching, I won an award, and I was walking with an historian who is from the Carnegie Foundation, who also teaches a history course at a university in the Midwest. And he said to me one day, he said, "You know, Elizabeth, sometimes I feel like a partner in an unholy alliance. I pretend to teach, and my students pretend to learn." And I said to him, "You know, you've only got it half right. When I returned to teaching, those students weren't even." So that sounds like we are student bashing. But when you think of the amount of stimulation they get from media and from technology. Cognitive psychologists have determined that their brains actually have been rewired. They are different. And when they come into our classes, where we very methodically often present our information in linear ways, some of them are quite bored and disinterested. Some, however, are lost and overwhelmed. And the look on their faces, whether they're lost and overwhelmed or whether they're bored and disinterested, is the same. Teaching today is very tough. And one of the things that so amazes me is how universal it is. It doesn't matter if I'm in Japan or in Colombia or at medical universities in the United States. Faculty are struggling with engaging their students. So we want our students to be engaged. But how do we accomplish that? I was actually asked to write a book on student engagement after I had won all of these awards. And I realized that the term was being used all over the place, but no one had really defined it in a way that I felt was useful for me in the classroom. And if you don't know where you're going, how will you know when you get there? So I decided one of the first things that I was going to deal with is to try to define what is student engagement. Now, if we stay later and we have a chance to talk over a cocktail, I'll give you a little bit more of the back history on this, but I will tell you, one thing I knew in my heart as a teacher and as a human being, it's not about entertainment. I thought there is no way that we as college professors can compete with the kind of production values that are out now there in the media. We can't entertain them, and we shouldn't be trying to entertain them. It's also not about technology and fancy bells and whistles. I don't know about here, but in the United States, new things come along and everybody thinks that's what's going to solve all of our problems. That's what's going to engage all of our students. And what we find time and time again is that these fancy bells or whistles are just as apt to confuse students as it is to maybe interest or intrigue them. So I eventually came up with a theoretical model that helped me look at engagement by suggesting that it was the synergistic interaction of two components. One is motivation, but the other is active learning. And I will say this just to share with you a bit of a backstory. When I first went into all of this, I thought it was only motivation. But I was working with one of the most established premier faculty experts in education of the 20th century. And her name is, as I told the people on Wednesday, K. Patricia Cross. And I say, what does student engagement mean to you, Pat? And she said, student engagement is about a student moving to higher levels of cognitive functioning. They have to be thinking better. They have to be thinking critically. That's student engagement. And as I told the people on Wednesday, I said to her, to take the earbuds out of their ears first. And she'd say, I give you this much for motivation, this much for motivation. And finally, I told her, I said, Pat, your concept of motivation comes from the fact that your whole teaching career has been in graduate programs at Harvard and at Berkeley. By definition, those students are already engaged. I'm teaching in an open admissions college where we take only the top 100%. And those students have to learn to care first. So, if motivation is one component, what does that mean? Jerry Brophy at the University of Michigan defines motivation with students as the enthusiasm and the degree to which they invest attention and effort in their learning. Now, motivation has been studied for many, many, many decades. And one of the earliest is the behaviorist model, where if you want a type of behavior to continue, you reward it. If you want it to stop, you either provide some disincentives or punish it, or you ignore it. I know that that's a simplistic description of a very complex theoretical model. However, that model has permeated education in the United States, and I dare say in most places in the world. We reward with good grades, we punish with penalties, with poor grades, and what can happen, though, is that students end up losing their focus on learning. All they want is the carrots, and they want to avoid the sticks. I have faculty tell me from all sorts of institutions, whatever happened to students' curiosity? Why don't they come in with some innate interest in learning? And I would propose part of it is that they are a product of our decades of a behaviorist-based educational system. Now, there's other models of motivation. You're probably also all very familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, where in order to move up this pyramid, you have to deal with more basic needs first. And we know that. If a student comes into our classes starved or exhausted because they worked or partied all night, they're not going to be able to function at the level that we call engagement. Many, many models of motivation, but many contemporary motivation theorists say that they all can be described as the product of value and expectancy. A product rather than a sum, because you can't not have one of these two components, and it's value and it's expectancy. So let's look at value first. The theorist suggests that unless you value something, you can't be motivated to do it. And so those of us who are college professors, somewhere along the line, became drawn to our disciplines because we found them so fascinating. So it's really disheartening when our students are looking at the watch, and as soon as it's time to go, they burst out of the classroom as though they've just been released from prison. I had a faculty member tell me a few weeks ago, she says, why for my students is the best class a canceled class? What's wrong with that picture? If you actually survey students, and I have, many of them will say, when I ask, why are you in my class? They say, because I'm checking off a general education pattern requirement, because it's in my degree, it's because of this, it's because of that. They rarely say, because I really wanted to learn what you've got to teach me, Dr. Barkley. It's another one of these reasons. So they're looking at our courses as though those courses are stepping stones towards what they really want, or they are obstacles. Now, this is not, new. When I was still at the university, I used to get a kick out of these curriculum sheets, and at the top, they would always say, you take these courses, and these courses will prepare you for a career in music. And I remember my little snarky, rebellious part always wanted to put an asterisk there and say, these courses will prepare you for a career in music, of which there are none, because I don't see that there's any careers in classical music. Or I'd want to say, these courses will prepare you for a career in music in the 19th century, because everything you're teaching me is so out of date. So helping students find value in what they're learning is not completely, a new problem. But I want to give you one example in my own courses. I was teaching, as you know, traditional classical music history. I don't know if you know this composer, but that's Johannes Brahms. And one day I was looking at him and I thought, from the perspective of my students, who are extremely diverse, he looks like a fat, old, bearded white guy. Now, it's not that they have anything against fat, old, bearded white guy, and I don't think I'm insulting anyone in this audience, because one of their favorite cultural icons meets that description. But it's that. And somebody mentioned, well, it also looks like these musicians, ZZ Top, they could all be stunt doubles. But for my students, Johannes Brahms was about as real to them as Santa Claus. So I took a different approach, and I found a picture of him when he was college age, and I talked about how he was so under the overwhelming shadow of Beethoven. How could he do anything? How could Brahms do anything different? Beethoven had already figured out everything there was to do about music. I talk about how he was in love with his best friend's wife, how his best friend tried to commit suicide. And I try to make him more real so that then the students can maybe say, oh, well, he's more real, he's not just a bearded old fat white guy like Santa Claus. So I wondered one day, though, recently. I thought, if students are not particularly interested in my course, I always thought it was just my course. They're only not interested in my course. What about college? And I started talking to them, and I started thinking about, why did I go to college? And I thought, well, I went to college to become educated because my family put a strong value on being an educated person. You want to grow up to be an educated person. Well, today, there are incredible and increasing ways for students who want to become educated outside of an academic environment. Why go to college? Well, I wanted to get a good career. Well, students know that getting a college degree does not automatically mean that they're going to get a good career. In the United States, 44% of graduates 25 and up are underemployed. Why go to college? To become financially secure. Well, I don't know about here, but in the United States, the average debt is $27,000, and these are unforgivable debts. So students know when they're done with college, many of them have a crippling financial debt to pay back. Why go to college? To learn. Well, some people learn better outside of a classroom than within it. There was a new book that came out a few years ago, and it had the provocative title of Chucking College, Achieving Success Without Corruption. And this is what she says: don't go to college. You lose the vital years of your life, and you'll never be able to regain them. So, moving from theory to practice, as you look at your own context, particularly those of you who are faculty, how do you help students find the value in what they're learning? And if you're looking at it in other contexts, if you're looking at it for yourself, why are you motivated to lose 5 pounds? Or sufficiently motivated to actually lose it, which has been my case for about a year. Find out what you are not valuing or what you need to do to find the value. On Wednesday, I had the unique privilege of talking with a rather, it was about 20 faculty and administrators from your campus here. And I just wanted to share with you one of their ideas. One of them mentioned how she takes great effort to show how everything that they are learning within the classroom applies within their later career choices. So the motivation theorist suggests that you need value, but you also need expectancy. If you don't value it, you can't be motivated, but you also need expectancy. So what is expectancy? It's the belief that you can succeed. Now, we have Henry Ford, who I think captured the essence so elegantly when he said, whether you think you can, think you can't, you're right. So it's important for a person to be motivated, to have a high-level expectancy that with effort, they will be able to succeed. Now, this has been the focus of much research. And Martin Covington at the University of California at Berkeley found 4 different expectancy models within students. He found success-oriented students, who of course are our best, most wonderful students, are the students who really do value learning because they've been successful throughout their academic careers and they have no reason to believe that they won't be successful now. Overachievers are the students who have had some difficulty throughout their educational experience, and so they want to succeed, but they succeed by being overachievers. They're the kinds that often pester us for a few more points, or why did they get a low grade? Failure avoiders, of course, want to succeed, but they want to do it by avoiding failure. So just tell me what I need to do. I don't want to take any risks. It has to be very precise. I want to succeed, but I want to succeed by avoiding failure. And then, of course, there's failure accepting. Students who have been so numbed by the educational institution, they have no expectancy that this time will be any different, and they're extremely motivated. Now, you may not have them here in this institution, but in my 100% open access institution, we really are, as part of our social justice agenda, targeting different populations to try and bring them in and help them be successful. Many of them have failure accepting issues, and it's very, very difficult to motivate them. it's kind of interesting to think about how were you as a student. I know, I'm going to tell you, I was an overachiever because I didn't always function so well in academic environments. Now, for years and years and years and years, I have always sent out an email before I knew anything about the theory to students before the quarter started. I said, thank you for enrolling my class. I'm delighted you are here. For years, thousands of students have taken this course and been successful, and I have every reason to believe you will be successful too. I thought I was just being nice. But now I'm realizing I'm addressing that expectancy component. But now compare this to this. This class is all tough, 50% of you will fail. Now, who is that? And we all know some professors like that. Who is that going to motivate? Maybe the success-oriented students, and if that's all you want, if you're not worried about anybody else, okay. But the rest of them, it's going to cause so much emotional anxiety that it's going to interfere with their success. But I decided to add in something else to talk with you about today based on my discussion with some of your faculty on Wednesday and based on the wonderful breakfast that I had this morning hosted by the Guardian Group. Because I am discovering, and some of my professors, and certainly ones in here, are discovering a kind of some new twist on expectancy. It's like we have spent so many years trying to make sure that everybody's esteem was intact that we're now seeming to get students who are coming into our classrooms that are expecting to succeed without any effort. My parents paid the tuition, I'm breathing, I'm here, so why shouldn't I succeed? This is calling for whole new kinds of research, and I wanted to just share with you one of my own experiences last term. So I'm teaching an honors class, and I've gotten a little bit of fame for a kind of a model that I had developed, which has been so effective. I say I empower students to be architects of their own learning by providing lots of choice and pathways to different learning goals. So I'm telling my honors students this, and they're all just kind of looking at me. I can tell they're not buying it. I'm thinking, what's wrong with this picture? And finally, one student raises a hand, just tell me exactly what I need to do to get an A. I go, oh, well, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, you have freedom of choice. They're still just looking at me. So after I left the class, I got an email within about 10 minutes. I opened it up, and it started out, a bunch of us got together after class, which is not what you want to do. But they basically said, we don't like your way of thinking. We want you to tell us exactly what we need to do, and we'll do it. Get it on our transcript, and we're done. But I always adapt, which is why I'm still here. And so I decided to make a very clear path for those students who wanted that path. And I sent it out to an email almost immediately after. And I so wanted to address it like this. Dear big babies, this is what you can do if all you want to do is to get the A. So students, some of them are preferring more structure. I think they've been raised to expect that. But somebody suggested they might be the grown-up kids, the helicopter parents. So I'm going to share with you an anecdote I shared this morning, and they seem to like it, so I'm going to share it with you. So I was going through security to get onto the airplane, and I'm living next to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which is one of the most competitive universities in the country. So this young man, obviously a student, was walking through security, and he had not one, but two parents helping him through the process. So one parent was untying his shoes, and the other parent was petting his head, fixing his hair, and telling him, remember, when you get past security, fill your bottle up with water. And I'm thinking, oh, parents, get a life and let this poor student get his own life. We're propping them up so much. The only way they're going, my mother used to say, the role of a parent is to give your children wings, then kick them out the nest as I kicked off my shoes, and let them fly. If we keep propping them up, they have no ways of developing and strengthening their wings. So I wonder if, oh, you just graduated with preschool. You get to wear your own little cap and gown and have a keynote speaker because you made it through preschool. Sorry, folks, I'm towards the end of my career, so I can say these kinds of things. So from theory to practice, what do you do, though, to help students expect that with effort, they will succeed? I am trying more and more to push with effort. I want to tell them, and I have to tell the administrators this, who want me to have all the students succeed, because that's the money. But I want to say, we have to tell them, you, the students, have a right to fail. You have a right to fail, and to come back to college when you're ready for it. But they have to expect that they can succeed, but they have to expect that it's going to take effort. So one of the faculty on Wednesday said one of the things that they did was they tried to make it very clear what the priority of things were to learn, because otherwise it was too easy for students to become overwhelmed. Let's look for just a moment at the intersection between these. So if a student doesn't value the task and doesn't expect to succeed, the predicted response is resistance, rejection, resentment, and anger at being coerced into a perceived totally pointless activity. That's disengagement. If a student doesn't value the task but expects to succeed, they'll evade it, do the minimum, their attention drifts to competing interests. You tell them in a group discussion, talk about this, they know the answer, they know they can talk about it, so what do they do instead? Talk about the party that they're going to that night. If they value it but don't expect to succeed, and I'm getting more of these students because we are recruiting quite heavily internationally, and we have students who come in who have language issues. They value what they're getting, but they're a little worried about their language issues. They make excuses, pretend to understand, deny their difficulties. I ask them, do you understand? And they say, yes, I understand, but they don't really. So engagement happens when they expect to succeed with effort and value it. So Lee Schulman, who was the former president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, says engagement begins with motivation. And we agree on that, right? Pat Cross ultimately said, well, I don't know if it begins with motivation, but she now says motivation is important. But the one thing that I like to remind people of is that if you're talking about motivation as value and expectancy, that product, you know that each individual comes in with different values and different levels of expectancy, especially in our large classes and with all this diversity. So we can't motivate. That's a choice they make themselves. But we can and need to, as our moral responsibility, to provide a context that more of them will find. But I've experienced, and I know seasoned faculty members have experienced, there are some students that come in with such baggage regarding value or expectancy, there's nothing you're going to do that is going to motivate them at this point in their life or maybe ever. So we need ways that they can exit and maybe come back at another time, because it's ultimately their choice. The second component was active learning. Active learning has become an umbrella term for lots of different pedagogies like service learning, collaborative learning, and I have to constantly remind myself, and I know many faculty do this, to not get misled into the thinking that active learning means that they're just being active, right? So you can recognize the fallacy in that of small groups talking to each other. They may not be learning, but they're being active. So active learning is defined in a number of different ways. We want to move it from this to that. But basically, I feel that active learning means that students are taking an active role in connecting new understandings, integrating them into their current understandings and neuronal networks, and applying it in some sort of context. It's important to remember that learning starts with making connections. So the first thing that a brain does is it says, where have I seen anything like that before? And it searches, and then it starts building these, in cognitive psychology they call it schemata, but it's also just networks. And so learning is preserved networks of connections. And as you move from novice to expert, you develop more and more of these networks of connections, which is why we who are experts in an area can look at something and quickly process it. Whereas a novice, it's so hard. And as teachers, we get frustrated. We say, why don't you understand this? I explained it to you 3 times. They don't have the complex networks upon which to hang information. But this is something else that I changed after this morning's breakfast because I feel so strongly about it. That foundational knowledge has to also be applied. It has to be applied by having students write, speak, solve problems, think critically, work individually, work collaboratively. And the reason for that is that when I was growing up, and when many of you were growing up and going to college, knowledge was power. And now please don't get caught up in just the term knowledge. Because knowledge, I could also say information. But so don't worry about that so much. I'm just trying to get a certain concept through here. But this is what it was. You went to universities because that's where all the knowledge was. Last year, I had the privilege of going to your sister campus in Kingston in Jamaica. And I was at the Guardian Group breakfast. And somehow breadfruit came up as a concept. I said, well, what is a breadfruit? And within 2 seconds, somebody from the Guardian Group came up with their smartphone. They said, well, here's a breadfruit. This is what it looks like. This is what it is on a tree. This is how we prepare it. Here's some recipes for it. Everything was right in their cell phone, right in their smartphone. So that kind of information is ubiquitous. And students know that. All they have to do is go to their smartphone. And because it's so available, it's cheap. They see it as cheap. Because it is cheap. All you have to do is go to your smartphone. So what we need to do is to show them how to use it. Because that's priceless. Knowledge is cheap, or information is cheap, but the ability to use it is priceless. What I want to tell my students, and I'm going to go back to telling them now, when they talk about not valuing college, there's I'm never going to get a job. I'm only going to be in debt. I want to tell them, somebody's going to have to succeed. Businesses and every sector is searching for good people who can think, who can write, who can solve problems, who are dependable, who are reliable, who know how to work together. There are going to be people who succeed. Why don't you be one of them? And use my classroom as a laboratory to develop the kinds of skills that you're going to need to succeed. In the United States, we have this global learning for the new century, and these are the type of competencies they're saying. We have to help our students learn how to write, learn how to speak, learn how to give presentations, learn how to do mathematics. Interestingly, these cannot be learned passively. You can't learn to write sitting there listening to me talk about writing. Another thing is that they can be learned outside of academia. Street smarts. They can be learned outside of academia. So learning how to use knowledge is our real added value today. That's a terribly huge and deep shift that is so different for professors such as myself who have been teaching for a long time in the information delivery to change. What do you do to help students ensure, or to help ensure that your students are active participants in their own learning? That they're not just sitting there listening to your knowledge, but that they are actually applying it. One of the professors in the Wednesday meeting, who also I know is here, because I wanted to talk with him more about it, he says, I start my courses with team-based games. He teaches business course, and it's simulation where immediately students are put into a position where they're making decisions about the technology, about, what's Simon? They're making all these decisions, so it immediately applies to what they will be doing. So the theoretical model that I propose is that student engagement is the synergistic interaction between motivation and active learning. You have to have both. You can see how it does not make sense to say it's only, at least in education, it's not only motivation. You can have a classroom full of motivated students, and if they're not learning, I don't call that engagement. On the other hand, you can have a classroom full of students who are learning, but if they're feeling coerced and angry about it, that's not it. I think that you need both, but I have, for myself, identified 3 conditions that I think help build that synergy, and it's because if you were to read the book, they address both sides of that equation. And condition 1 is that the task has to be appropriately challenging. So somewhere between been there, done that, and dazed and confused is the unique position on that continuum for every individual student that is the perfect place for them to learn. And Lev Vygotsky, who's the Russian theorist, talks about this as the zone of proximal development. Where you are, where you could be, and you have to be able to stretch to that for learning. Now, in my own classes, I have such diversity of students. Last year, I had a first-generation college student who came out of the migrant workers, and I had an emeritus Stanford physics professor. Now, I ask you, my friends, these are in my classroom. How do I approach that class with one set of tasks and information that is going to get both of those and everybody in between in their same perfect space of appropriately challenging? My second is that you have to build a sense of learning community. We were talking this morning and we were talking Wednesday about watching people walk down the road together, each checking their own smartphones and not interacting with each other. How be sitting at a restaurant, my husband and I will go to a restaurant, there'll be a whole table and everybody's just sitting there working on their, like, talk, people. Talk. Interact. This is the future of the globe is based on people being able to talk, not checking something out on their smartphone. We know student preferences are to connect to a group. In fact, it's because they're checking on their smartphone, texting all the time, that it's so nerve-wracking or so annoying to many of us in the classroom. So they are connecting, but it's through this little device. I saw this sign and I wanted to share it with you. Honk if you love Jesus. Text while driving if you want to meet him. So they want to connect. We have to help them learn to connect with other human beings in the moment. And the reality of many of our classes, and I doubt that this is happening in your institution, but it certainly is in mine, they are told to sit here like you are right now and listen to me. In my own classes, I try and form base groups to force them to work together and learn to work together throughout the term. The third component is to teach for holistic learning. College professors particularly tend to be very comfortable in the cognitive realm. And the cognitive realm is the thinking realm. That's where we were raised and where we flourish. But we know from research that emotions can trump cognitive processing. And people who are teaching remedial math know, they say, you have to get to the fear and the anxiety and address that before they can even begin to learn the kinds of cognitive processes. So I suggest that as you are looking at this, you try to find ways to cross domains, not only the cognitive domain, but the affective, the emotional feeling domain, the psychomotor domain, having people do things. And I personally believe in the moral domain because I think unless we help our students see the ethical implications of what they're doing, we're in a very sorry space as a future. So from theory to practice, conditions that contribute to synergy, how do you help your students work at an appropriate level of challenge, feel like they're valued members of a learning community, and interact within a community, and finally learn holistically? I wanted to share with you one of the most powerful things, of many powerful things I heard on Wednesday. And that was a woman who was teaching in the health areas. And when she had difficulty with engaging her students, She said she changed, and she's experimenting with this, as I understood it, by requiring her students in their very first course to go to a hospital and observe what's going on there and see what people are doing in their different jobs and say, what would you like to do? What do you not want to do? Who would you like to be like? Who would you not like to be like? Why in our academic programs do we not have that as one of the very first things that students do? Instead of waiting till they're 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 years out, thousands of dollars into it to go into a hospital or an equivalent space and say, I don't think I like that. Bit late. So it was a very powerful idea. So my theoretical model is that motivation or engagement is that synergistic interaction between motivation and active learning, and that it has these 3 conditions which contribute to the synergy. I am happy to answer your questions individually. We're not going to have questions now, but I did want to close with a few quotes. I like this quote: education is going forward from cocksure ignorance to thoughtful uncertainty. I love this one. Education in America seems to be the only commodity of which the customer tries to get as little as he can for his money. Now, I'm sure that doesn't apply here in Trinidad, but it applies in the United States. But my favorite quote is from the Irish poet William Butler Yeats, who said, education is not filling a bucket, but lighting a fire. And I saw that after I came up with all my own stuff, and I thought, he's captured it so much more elegantly than me, because filling a bucket is the metaphor for passive learning. He says it's not passive learning, therefore it's active learning. And motivation is the lighting the fire. So I came up with my own little way of remembering these different components. Somebody mentioned earlier in the introductions that we must pass the torch to the next generation. Of course, the next generation has to be there both ways. But how do you pass the torch? You light the torch. First, you have to have the torch on fire. So my 5 terms of engagement are motivation, active learning, that the task is tough, but not too tough, that we build a level of community, and that we aim for holistic learning. And I would propose that if you use that framework to look at what's happening in your classroom, what's happening in your life, what's happening in your own engagement in your institution as an employee or in your civic context, something there is missing, and that's where you can target your energies. But I wanted to share with you 2 final quotes that I think are more hopeful. And one is from a colleague that I have so much respect for on my campus. She takes the most difficult students. That's her specialty, is taking the students who are failure accepting, who have been traumatized, and she works with them to try and help them find how to be in a higher education setting. And she says, teaching is a life of service. And as everyone knows, a life of service is well lived. And then I want to share with you one last quote, and it was from the winner of the Guardian Group UWI award last year at Kingston campus. And I found it very moving. And this quote didn't come from the professor, who is a professor of sign language for the hearing impaired, but it came from a comment of one of the students. And I thought, we teachers have to remember this and aim for this. The student said, having you as my teacher has changed the course of my life. I'm going to share with you one last quote, and it's not up here, because we get so overwhelmed and we think there's no way I can do all of this. It's really daunting. If you take teaching seriously, it is tough, tough, tough work. And when you look at all the challenges, it's so easy to say the students are broken. They're not. I can never overcome all the obstacles. And I just recently came across a quote that is attributed to the Dalai Lama, and this is the quote. I don't have a slide. It says, he said, if you think you're too small to make a difference, try spending the night in a room with a mosquito. Thank you.